Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. I wanted to get started right on time. I'm just making sure you can all see what I can, so that's a good start. And then I'm going to turn on my webcam as well so you can see me, because as we all know, we're all doing everything virtually, but I am actually here. Hello. Okay, so we have a lot of people joining today, which is wonderful. And I think we have, oh gosh, over 150 people signed up. We're at about 60 people right now in attendance, and I'm sure we'll have people joining in the next few minutes because everyone's busy with a lot of things going on. I do want to make sure that no matter what, we end at least a couple minutes early because I want to respect everyone's schedules. And if you're going straight to lunch or another meeting, we will not go over time. The other thing is that we are recording this and we are going to put the recording of this on YouTube. So if someone missed it and they wanted to see the presentation as you're seeing it, essentially it is going to go up on YouTube in a few days. And so there's that option. But what I wanted to go over really quickly, I know some people may still be joining, but for those of you who are here now, I want to go over a few key pieces of sort of how to navigate the system. And fortunately, there are a couple things that will hopefully help if there are any sort of technical issues. We'll start with kind of how to help with that. So on your interface, you'll see that panel on the right-hand side, and this little orange arrow, you can maximize or minimize that panel. But if you look at it, you're going to see something that says handouts. And if you click on that white arrow, you're going to see two drop-downs. One of them is a PDF of today's slide deck. The other one, and this is very important, the other one is the webinar tech support handout. And I would say that in my experience, most of the time, if people are having technical issues, it's related to sound and audio. And there are all sorts of troubleshooting and suggestions of how to solve that if that's going on. It includes the phone number, the PIN number, if you needed to call in instead, if you're having any computer audio issues. There's other troubleshooting suggestions for other technical issues, links to extra support. We have a large audience. We're almost at 100 people right now, so it's going to be fairly difficult for me to help you directly with tech issues, which is why I want to make sure that you know that that tech support document is there for you, so you can get the help that you need and be dialed in and can hear me okay and all of that. So that is under the handout. So if there's any technical issues, start there, download that PDF file, and look through some options. The other thing is that if you need to communicate with me, and of course we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, that is going to be in the questions box. So that's different than the chat box. So do not use the chat box, use the questions one. So you'll see the little white arrow next to questions. If you click that drop down, you'll type that in. One thing, and I know it says this at the top here as well, when you type in a question, I'm the only one who sees the question and the only one who sees who sent it. And a lot of times people may be thinking, if I type in a question, will everyone see that I asked that? The answer is no. We tend to default to anonymity because some people are less comfortable asking a question if they know others are going to know that they were the one who asked it. So if you notice me glancing over, that's me just keeping an eye on the questions box in case anyone is having anything they want to ask about the content related to today's presentation. If there's something that you have a question about right as I'm going along, feel free to type it in there. I may or may not have time to get to it right then, but we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. So the other thing is that although you'll see on your end this little hand raise feature, it doesn't really work in this setting because when someone clicks on that, all I see is that a hand went up, but I don't know whose hand went up or why, and the audience is muted, and so it makes it kind of difficult to have any sort of way of assisting you, and I don't want anyone to feel ignored. So if you want to ask a question or have any, anything that you want to ask, please type that into that questions box. We are going to do a couple of live poll questions. They are completely anonymous, and of course, the more people that do the poll, the more interesting the results, and no one will know who answered, no one will know who even participated in it, and no one is going to know who answered what. So it is a truly anonymous poll, and so of course, the more people who do it, the better. Trying to think if there's anything else I can think of right now. I think we're good. I know that we still have a few people joining. Just as a reminder, again, all of those handouts in the handout section has a slide deck, has the tech support question and answer. So hopefully we have a smooth webinar. All right, I usually do that in about 4 minutes, so we're good to go. So I want to start getting into today's actual topic. So we're talking about reintegration, how to cope with reintegration. I'm going to briefly go over the stages of isolation, and then I really want to kind of talk about what are some common experiences we might be having right now. And then, of course, what are some things we can do? What I wanted to mention briefly here is that with the stages of isolation, similarly to when I'm talking about stages of grief, everyone experiences this differently. So the first two stages are on this slide, the next two are on the next slide. You may think to yourself, yeah, that's exactly what happened to me, or how I experienced it. Or you may think I didn't have that stage, or they were in a different order, or whatever, or this isn't really in line with my experience. All of those are equally valid. So this is one person's perception of kind of what they've noticed. And I've seen this a lot too with working with individuals and doing trainings and talking to people. But this is not meant to tell everyone that everyone had that exact same experience. So we saw a lot of these first two about a year ago. And I want to talk more about kind of the next two. So we were looking at this kind of initial confusion and panic, about March of last year, obviously, and then going into sort of this, one could describe honeymoon phase for some people. They didn't have to commute to work anymore. Some people liked working from home if that's what it switched to at that time. Others did not. Again, everyone had a different experience. But there was sort of that time period that I heard a lot of people, and this it's like this novel change. And again, maybe I don't have to have as busy of a day because less commuting and things like that. But then we start moving into these second two stages. What I saw a lot of was the resentment started coming up last fall, is that the weather got worse. There weren't really any, there's still a lot of questions about vaccines. They weren't readily available yet. It was worse weather, getting into the holidays. People were tired of being social isolating, not being able to connect with people. So I think it was really this combination happening around fall, winter last year. And then, as we're talking about now, we're sort of moving into this reunion phase of reintegration. What does that mean? Because it can look different for everybody, and everyone has different experience with it. So thinking kind of about where you're at right now, we're going to do the first of a few poll questions. So I always think it's good to kind of get some engagement and see how people are feeling. All right. So I'm going to launch the first poll here. You should see it on the screen in a moment, and you can just answer it if you'd like. Again, these polls are completely anonymous. We have some votes coming in already, fast and furious. Oh my gosh, almost half of you have already voted. All right, great. So I'll give it a few more seconds here. I've got about 85% of you have voted. So I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds. All right. So I'm going to close that poll out. We had exactly 90% of you voted, and I'm going to share the results. All right, so you should be able to see what I'm seeing there in terms of those poll results. So we have a whole mix, and this is also, part of providing these polls is of course, it's just helpful to have some interaction, because this is, of course, we're still not doing a ton of in-person trainings, but also that normalization and validation. Even though that very high anxiety is a smaller percentage, it's not, there's still multiple people. So if you felt like you rated yourself at that level, so did other people. So everyone is experiencing this in their own way. There's not a right or wrong way to be feeling right now, but it's kind of across the board with the other three. So just kind of want to give you an idea of that. And also, I completely recognize that as with a lot of polls like this, we could ask this again tomorrow and you may have scored it differently. We are noticing that, what I'm seeing a lot is that we'll kind of feel okay and then we'll feel stressed again. And a lot of times we're on this emotional roller coaster, especially during times of change, let alone when our physical safety, and it's a global pandemic, so that just can exacerbate a lot of that stress. All right. So what are some emotions that we're feeling? I don't think this is new to anyone, but I do think, again, it really helps to kind of validate some of this. And there may be something on this list that you connect to more than something else, or something you would add to this. But whenever we are having to adjust to our work environment, to the way we do our work, to our home environment, whether we live by ourselves, with other people, whether we are providing pet care, child care, elder care, all of the above, none of the above. Like, everybody has their own circumstances, and no matter what, it can be stressful in terms of making an adjustment for reintegration. It has been a long time since a lot of people have worked back in an office. So say for you, you've been working from home and now that change is going back into an office. There's a lot of things that come into play in terms of reintegration stress. And for many people, there is the logistical stress of, now I've got to factor in a commute again and figure out how that impacts the rest of my schedule. There's also, stress of financial. So if we're commuting more, we're paying more on gas. There's all sorts of different things we're trying to figure out. And over the last 15 or so months, we may have adjusted to when we get groceries, how we do that, who does what, and all of that has to be figured out again for many of us. So that can create stress of how do we sort of adjust to all these logistics while I'm trying to figure out how to just even be back in the office again. And when we're more anxious, we tend to have a tough time thinking more logically, which creates more stress around the logistics. It's kind of this unfortunate feedback loop, if you will. So when we talk about stress management skills, that can really come into play. Obviously, a big piece of this is concerns about our health. Yes, vaccines are much more readily available, and that is wonderful. It doesn't mean that we don't still concern ourselves about our physical health and our loved ones, and that is directly impacting us and the people around us. So that is, again, going to be, a major stressor for most people. What I want to really clarify too is that we may know this, but I still think it's a good reminder. My background is a trauma psychologist, and I've also been I'm a certified drug and alcohol counselor, but I've worked with individuals, groups. I primarily do teaching now, but the biggest thing I think is so helpful is remembering that all of us are experiencing this differently. There's not a right or wrong way to feel about this. What we tend to do is compare ourselves to others and think, for example, my partner is either way more stressed than me or way less stressed. And why is that? Is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with them? We do a lot of comparisons or judging of ourselves or others, and we are all going to experience things differently. Some people are like, yes, I'm so excited to go back to the office. This couldn't have come soon enough. Other people maybe really liked working from home or wish they had a mixture. Everyone has a different perspective. And I think there's also, it's interesting going into better weather as well. So work and outside of work, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think sometimes there's a sense of almost like making up for lost time a little bit, like, now let's do everything, and that can be overwhelming for a lot of people, even if someone's an extrovert. And that goes back to financial stress. So if suddenly restaurants are reopening, activities are reopening, that's more money. And there's a lot of stressors, and I think sometimes a person may feel, either my friends or my partner or this person in my life or family are really excited to do all these things. Maybe I have more anxiety about that, or, there's different levels of comfort with how we're sort of adjusting back to this. And this, again, someone's talking about asking how this relates to frontline workers as well. And we have done presentations specifically for essential workers because there's, of course, a Venn diagram of stressors. There are people who have been on the front lines out in the community working since this all started. And so there's different types of stressors, different ways it can affect them. And we have a training focused just on that as well. And that's a really good question. What we try to do is kind of talk about this as how can we be as inclusive to everyone as possible in terms of what are common things that are coming up for us. And so I try to really think about, as we're looking at this, for an individual, for oneself, to think, how would I notice, just for myself, that I was coping with reintegration more effectively? So number one, what are my biggest anxieties around it? And then number two, how would I notice that I was coping more effectively? Sometimes, and as we start talking more about coping skills as we go through here, it can help us kind of pay attention to how we're checking in with how we're feeling. So, are my main stressors related to work? Are they related to kind of the logistics outside of work? And that may impact what type of coping skills I use. And dialectics here, all that means is that two things can be true at the same time. So we can have one feeling about reintegration, and that can be different than someone else's feeling, and both are equally valid. So this really helps us, I think, kind of slow down, check in with what we need, be more empathetic and open to if someone needs something different than us, and having that conversation. So just some of these kind of initial normalizations that everyone's on some level, I think, feeling stressed, but that can look different and that can be for different reasons. So if we're thinking about workplace concerns, obviously this first one, physical safety, what are the policies and procedures? How will I know what those are? What if they change? How will we get those updates? And I'll talk about self-advocacy here in a moment. There's a couple great comments and questions coming in, so I'm not ignoring you, but I definitely want to get to some of those. How to regain a sense of community with colleagues, because we may be reintegrating, but it's not necessarily going to look identical to how it was before. So how do we, what was our sense of community pre-pandemic, and how is it going to look now? What are ways that we can support each other in this? What are ways that we can check in? How have our meetings been going? A lot of times, one thing that can help is everyone's super busy, and it doesn't necessarily mean there have to be more meetings, because sometimes it's like that can create meeting fatigue and they're not super productive. But what I've found a lot of times organizations can do, or staff can do if they have like team huddles or weekly check-in meetings, is to add some time at the beginning or end of an already existing meeting just to check in with how people are doing. Because sometimes the only time spent when we're in a meeting is obviously work stuff, like here's what needs to happen, okay, good to go, done. But a lot of that sort of community building, that sense of morale, that sense of connection comes from just being able to talk to each other, and adding some time at the beginning and or end of a meeting instead of trying to add extra time into our already busy schedules can make a difference. So that can be something that you can either suggest, or if you're already doing, that's great. But even just small things to sort of connect to each other and find a sense of community is really important. And this is, everyone's different. Again, like that one of the individuals had mentioned, is that some people are essential workers, some people have been working from home and now they're going back into the office. Everyone's job role may have changed in some way. Sometimes, for a lot of companies, there was a layoff and then there was less people, so people were picking up tasks they hadn't done before. So there's a lot of different things going on. One of the big pieces that I'll talk about in terms of the coping skills is slowing down. And I don't mean slowing down like not getting work done, or not being efficient. But when we are anxious, we tend to just have a tough time slowing down and really thinking about, what do I need right now? And sometimes I try to just slow down for a moment and think, I'm doing the best I can. What do I need? And it's okay if it's tough right now. And what are some things I can do to support myself and self-advocate? So before I'm going to jump to the next slide. Yes, okay. So we're going to get to that in a moment. All right, hold on. There we go. Took a second, but we got back to the slide we needed to be on. So if we're thinking about what do I need right now, it helps to think what's showing up for me. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some examples. And so as I'd mentioned earlier, a good question to ask is, how would I notice that I was coping more effectively with reintegration, whatever that looks like for me and my job role? And what we may notice if we're not coping particularly well, which there is nothing wrong with you if you're struggling to cope with it, you may notice more apathy. So when that comes up, that's a lot of times related to burnout. When we just feel like we can't care anymore, we don't have the energy, we're super unmotivated, that kind of thing. A lot of times we get irritable. So if we're feeling stressed, if we're feeling tired, if we're feeling uncertain or unsure about things, it gets covered with irritability, not intentionally, but just automatically. All of us have experienced that before. That is a human condition. So if you notice yourself getting sort of irritated more quickly, that's a sign that maybe you need some support in some way. And we'll talk about some of those coping skills. That social isolation piece, I know that sounds odd. It's like, yeah, that's what we've been doing. And what's interesting is that's what I think has been adding to some of our struggles, is that we're social beings as humans, and to stay safe, we've had to social distance, which has impacted our ability to have restorative self-care, such as a sense of community. And so if we're feeling apathetic, if we're feeling stressed, if we're feeling anxious, we will sometimes socially isolate. For example, this can show up if someone's not really talking in meetings anymore, like maybe someone was talkative or they had ideas And you may notice it, whether it's virtual or in person, they're just a little bit more reserved. They're not talking as much. It may be something where we can check in with them, see how they're doing. That reduced productivity or reliability. It's really hard to concentrate when we're under stress. So if it's harder to manage your time or work on projects, all of us are doing the best we can again, but these can be some signs that you can notice in yourself. And this is where it's figuring out, what do I need in different categories? Because there may be a logistical need that you can talk to your supervisor about that might help you in terms of just organizing your week or organizing your day. There could be emotional needs where you can call us as the EAP and talk to a counselor, just that anxiety or stress. Social needs, sort of like I talked about, adding some time to check in with people in meetings or schedule time with peers or friends, whether it's still virtual or in person based on safety guidelines, and really think about, what's coming up for me that I need right now. For a lot of us, it's all of these things. It's not necessarily just going to be one, but if we can figure out what's coming up for me and what do I need, it can sort of narrow the strategies around how to address it. So if we're thinking about self-advocacy, because I think right now, a lot of us are trying to navigate a lot of unknowns in figuring out what is it that I even need. And I hear a lot of times employees will say, I'll go to my supervisor and say, I'm just feeling burnt out. I don't know what to do. And that's completely valid. And that's okay if that's where you're at. What I try to think about, sort of like we talked on these earlier slides, is why am I feeling this right now? And what might be most helpful for me to address some of this? And if it's workplace related, how do I advocate for my needs more effectively? And this is where some of these types of sentences, this kind of language, can elicit a more productive, kind of solution-focused conversation with your employer, with leadership. So here's one thing that would help me feel less burnt out, or here's one thing that would help me feel less anxious during this transition. It could be something as simple as maybe you've always had a standing meeting with your supervisor every Monday, and Mondays are hard to kind of have all of that. You're trying to catch up on other stuff. Maybe you could say, here's one thing that would make me feel less stressed during this transition. Is it possible if we move our meetings to Tuesday? Something like that. So there's a solution, there's an idea in mind. If it's possible or not, at least it creates a conversation around what are some things we can do. And I think that can sometimes really help with a sense of empowerment, is like going in with a solution in mind that would help you, and then advocating for that in a way that's respectful to you, to them, and just having an open dialogue around that. If you feel like you're overwhelmed and you're reintegrated and there's all these new tasks, it's okay to ask, how would you like me to prioritize my tasks? That's a totally fair question. If I'm concerned about my safety or others' safety, who should I talk to? What's the procedure for that? If you're not sure, asking these kind of open-ended questions in this way gives you information. It sort of allows you space in that dialogue to advocate for yourself, and in a way that the sort of energy behind it is, my goal is to be the best possible employee. Here's what would be really helpful for me to be able to do that. This kind of language. So we're meeting in the middle of how we can self-advocate for ultimately what's best for us and the organization, ideally. So if some of that language helps, I think that sometimes people will have anxiety around being vulnerable, or saying they need help, or saying they're struggling with reintegration. We spend a lot of time working with leadership as well of how to support employees. But from the employee side, it's also thinking about, what can I do to advocate for myself too? So if we're thinking about just self-care, how are we taking care of ourselves? I think a lot of us are well aware of this list here. And when I talk about, excessive use of substances or television, social media, I am not here to say that something is inherently always bad. This is really about our own awareness of our behavior changes. So if we realize that we're spending more time than usual binge watching TV, for example, or more time than usual on social media, and a lot of times it's thinking, is this restorative to me? Is this helping me? Or is this a way of just avoiding my feelings? And only we know the answer to that. I can't tell you, only you would know that. So it's really just about noticing changes in our behavior in a non-judgmental way. That's the hard piece. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just that all of us are doing the best we can. And sometimes coping skills that we had used in the past, pre-pandemic, either weren't possible for a while, or harder to do. So not only are we having to adjust to reintegration or logistics in life related to work, we've also all found out we've had to do a lot of adjusting to the coping skills we use. For example, if someone loved going to their yoga class and that isn't happening because of the pandemic, and they're like, that was a huge, stress relief for me and really helpful for me. What do I do now? So this is really thinking about what do I need in terms of reassessing my coping strategies. And I think we're all seeing that we have to do that now again for reintegration. Because back to, for example, I know I've used this a lot, but if suddenly a person is commuting back into the office, for example, I know that's not everybody's situation, but for a reintegration sort of concrete example, someone may think, now with that added commute time or added cost related to gas, how is that going to impact the coping skills I had integrated into my life when I was working from home? So it's almost this readjustment and figuring out, things may look a little bit different for me right now, and that's okay. I know it's not easy, but having to readjust some of those hobbies, our exercise routine, whatever that looks like. Cooking, that's another thing. Someone may say it's stressful now trying to figure out time to cook healthy meals. There's also that social time and alone time. So for example, if you're living with other people, some people may need more time to themselves than others. And that goes back to that self-advocacy piece. So maybe you're living with others and it's a good time to sit down and think, well, we're reintegrating, whatever that looks like for us. And there's going to be some adjustments in terms of people's schedules. What do we need right now? For example, someone may say, one thing that would be really helpful for me, especially during this time of transition, because it's extra stress, is when I get home from work, I just need 30 minutes of time to myself. And that's completely fine, and maybe there's something that would be helpful to think about right now, like what would help me just be able to remain balanced, to have some space to practice self-care, because I think for many of us, it's like, oh my gosh, all this stuff is happening and there's this added stress. So what helps me stay grounded? What helps me, calm down? How does that look like in these times? And how do I advocate for my needs? Okay, I'm just being thoughtful of time here. All right, so I'm going to do a quick mindfulness activity with everyone, but I wanted to check something really quickly here. Before I do that, I'm going to launch another poll because I'm curious where everybody's at. And then once I get this information, we will do our mindfulness activity. Okay, launching that now. I already have my calm voice ready for this mindfulness activity. Okay, so we have about half of you have voted. Oh, we already have about 3/4 of you. Votes are coming in fast, so we'll give it about 10 more seconds. All right, so we had basically the exact same amount of you voted. So let's see what these results look like. Okay, kind of across the board again, but almost 1/4 of you feel confident. That's great. I'm not surprised that there's a pretty high number of that somewhat agree, and that's completely understandable. But again, no matter where you fall in this category, you're not alone, and we may have a different answer for this throughout the day. But just to kind of get an idea of where you feel like you're at on that. And then again, it's also that ability to think, why didn't I put myself at a somewhat disagree? What am I already doing? Or how am I even measuring this, for myself? So just kind of want to see where people are at. All right. So for this mindfulness activity, I'm going to turn my camera off so you don't have a distraction of kind of watching me, because I'm going to be going through a short script. It should only be about a couple of minutes. But if you see my webcam turn off, I did that on purpose. I promise. I'll be back in a moment, but I'm just going to read the script for you, and I just want the least amount of distractions possible. All right, so I'm going to go through this little mindfulness activity because sometimes I think we can talk our way through stress all day, but it helps to actually practice something. So some of you may have done mindfulness before, some may have not, but let's just go through this short mindfulness activity. So I would invite everyone to do it, but it's completely up to you. So I would start with just getting in a comfortable position. Probably many of you are sitting at your desk, sitting at your computer. So I want you to just start by bringing your awareness to your breath. And just noticing the natural inhale and exhale of your breathing. Try to pay attention to it without trying to change it in any way. Next, bring your awareness to your feet. Noticing your feet connected to the ground helps to feel settled and present. Notice your shoes on your feet. Allow all of your awareness to focus on that sensation. Next, bring your awareness to your legs. Are you sitting? Are you standing? If you're sitting, how does the chair feel? Continue checking in with your senses as you move up your body. Are you holding any tension in your shoulders or jaw? If so, take a moment to release that tension. Really focus on becoming aware of your body right here and now. Next, bring to mind a place that you have either been or would like to go that represents somewhere that is peaceful and calm. Oftentimes, people pick a place in nature, like a river, an ocean, favorite hiking trail, lake, or mountain. Somewhere that you would either like to go or that you have been that feels settling and calming. When this place is clear in your mind, notice your 5 senses. Look around the place and see the landscape, the colors, the textures. Notice if the sun is shining or if it's shady. Becoming aware of what you would see as you look around. Next, bring awareness to the sounds you would hear, the sounds that are close up and the sounds that you would hear at a distance. Really focusing on any of the calming and soothing sounds that are in this place. Now take in any scents that are in the calming place. If you're at the beach, you might smell the salt water or the sea air. Now take a moment and imagine what this place would feel like on your skin. Are you under the sunlight or shade? Are you swimming? Is it warm or humid? Is it cool or brisk? Is it windy? Really imagine what it would feel like to be in this place right now. Take another moment to absorb anything else that feels particularly calming and soothing from this place. Now we'll close this practice with 3 soothing inhales and exhale. So we'll inhale and then exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, and exhale. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back to the present moment. All right, I'm going to turn my webcam back on. I'm back. So that is one of many mindfulness activities. If you wanted to do other guided imagery activities, which that would be an example of one, there are quite literally, I think, thousands on YouTube for free if you just Google guided imagery. And they have many that are for specific things, like for sleep, for anxiety, for stress. And it really, I think, is an indicator of the power of our ability to self-soothe through just even being present or thinking about something that's calming. So I wanted to just allow space for people, all of us, to practice that in real time. So what are some other things that we can do? Because one thing that I find really helpful, and it's interesting because I'm looking at some of the comments and questions here, and for all of you who have typed anything so far, the first thing I can say is you're not the only one feeling that way. And either fears of reintegrating and the social skills required of that, also the added just, for some people, if they were working from home and they're going back into the office, there's more sounds, there's more kind of sensory overload, and that can be very anxiety inducing. And there's stress management skills that I think can help to have that we can do in the moment. Because I think for many people, there's a concern, and it's very common, of, the way I release stress is exercising or taking my dog for a walk, for example, or talking to my sibling. But in the middle of the workday, none of those things are probably going to be immediately accessible. And so we're sitting there thinking, I'm dealing with all this change and adjustment. It might be more sensory overload because of some of this change. And these coping skills I use are not necessarily accessible right in this moment. So I'm in this survival mode while I'm here, which is extremely exhausting. So one thing that I think is helpful, this is a 3-step relaxation mindfulness that I can't suggest enough. And I oftentimes try to put a sticky note or a reminder somewhere because we forget to do it all the time. And it can be 3 or 2 steps. So whatever works for you. But all you do is close your eyes, relax your face and relax your jaw and drop your shoulders. And if you tried that right now, my guess, and we have about 109 people live right now, my guess is the majority, myself included, found that you're holding some tension. Your jaw might be clenched, your shoulders are tense. And if you were to do that 5 minutes from now, you might be holding that tension again. There's nothing wrong with that. We're busy, we've got a lot of things going on. But that takes 2 seconds. You can do it anywhere, whether you're in a virtual meeting or in person with people. Small things like that are really powerful to just be like, how do I just give myself, physiology, a break? And I'm going out of order on some of this list here. Square breathing is another one. So that is that all 4 parts of your breath take the same amount of time. So the pause before you breathe in, say you'd count, for example, 4 seconds, and then breathe in for 4 seconds, pause for 4 seconds, and then breathe out for 4 seconds. And it doesn't have to be 4 seconds, whatever's comfortable for you. One thing I find helpful about that breathing technique is that it also gives your brain a task because sometimes when we're doing deep breathing to try to relax, our brain is still like, but tomorrow I have to do, and then it's spinning. If we have to track what part of our breath we're on and count, it gives our brain a job as well. Another thing is that there are lots of different strategies around tapping, and this is just basic kind of meridian physiology. So I move my camera so I can actually make sure you can see what I can see. So I'm like, I'll show them this, and they're like, oh, we can't see you. So I just want to make sure that you can see. So if you cross your wrists like this, and then that soft spot kind of right below your scapula bone, you would just tap back and forth. And simple things like that can help, that actually can regulate your system. And I think sometimes we tend to feel like the only way we can cope is to think our way out of something, and doing cognitive reframing, even doing that guided imagery we did, is incredibly powerful. So that is super helpful. And also physiologically, we need to be aware of what our body is feeling, which spatial distress tolerance can come into play there too. That's a fancy word for taking up more space in our environment. Say, for example, you're on the phone a lot for work and you're stressed with everything else going on. And on top of that, you're on a stressful call. If you stand up when you're on a call, you actually feel less anxious. If we take up more space in our environment, we'll feel less anxious because it's sending messages to our brain that we're safe enough to take up that much space. I've had people do slow jumping jacks, stand in a star pose, something that just allows you to be more expansive can help with some of that anxiety. And cognitive reframing, this is basic cognitive behavioral therapy. And as I talk about some of these things, if at any point you feel like you're practicing these strategies and they're still not effective, or the stress is still impacting your daily life, number one, that's very common. And that's where the EAP can come in. We provide counseling services, immediate phone counseling, but many counselors are going to practice CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, which a lot of this is how we frame a situation is going to determine how it impacts us. So one example would be if we go into worst case scenario thinking, which we often do, of, this situation is going to go terribly, or this is going to happen. It's kind of called future tripping. What you can do is actually write down that automatic thought of the worst case scenario, or something that you're imagining it to be negative, and then write down alternate outcomes. And it kind of challenges those immediate thoughts that our brain have. We talked about slowing down already, and also striving for balance. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, I do think there's a little bit of a sense of, if things are reopening, like, full steam ahead, we're making up for lost time, and really figure out for ourselves, what do I need to feel balanced? How much social time, how much alone time, what strategies do I need to feel calm and relaxed? That may look different than other people. How do I, seek out some support at work? If you're feeling like say, for example, your reintegration is going from working at home to in the office, and the office is louder, there's more sensory overload, maybe that's a conversation you can have with a supervisor. Is it possible that I can work in a different office, or get a noise machine in the hallway, or is there something that I could do that could help with some of that? These are some strategies, because if that's something that you're concerned about, you're not alone, and figuring out what you may need to help stay, calm and relaxed and present as possible. Yeah, someone had just mentioned that they do tapping on their forehead for headaches. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because when we're stressed, we get headaches a lot. There's also a great website called the Tapping Solution. So they have a ton of different ones. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because the cross the chest is one of many. The last thing I'll say here is that when we are feeling anxious, or if we are someone who identifies as being more of a perfectionist, that will actually show up in how we try to cope with that stress. So we'll sometimes be like, okay, for reintegration, I'm going to make sure I, do this coping strategy and then this, and we'll almost like overly try to control that too. There's a balance between prioritizing our self-care and making sure it's part of our calendar, and having conversations about what would be beneficial for us outside of work and at work. And also, we're all doing the best we can. So you may be like, I was doing good for a while, and then now I'm not again. And that's okay. That's okay. We're all trying to adjust. And one day, you know, 3-step relaxation or a guided imagery may be really effective. And another day it's like, this is not working. I need to pick up the phone and talk to a counselor at the EAP. Like there are times where it just, there's a lot of different things going on with us and we'll feel different days. And I would say that one of the biggest pieces of stress management really is that ability to practice self-compassion. You know, instead of there's something wrong with me that I have to fix, so I need to start practicing these coping skills, is that self-care is integrated, effective self-care is integrated with being an ally with our body. So instead of it failing us in some way, or that sort of perception that it is, of thinking it's actually really trying to protect me. Anxiety is in and of itself trying to protect us. It's like there's a threat, we're trying to, you know, rush of adrenaline to try to handle that threat. So our body and brain is trying to help us. It's just not always doing in the right way. So for me, I think it helps to really perceive it through a lens of, I know that, you know, you're trying to help me right now, but here's some things we're going to do to downregulate and slow down a little bit. So instead of thinking I have to cope perfectly or there's something wrong with me that it's hard to cope with this, shifting our perspective of that, I think, can help a lot with taking care of ourselves. This I find helpful. You know, I'm not going to go super in depth with a bunch of these because I want to allow some time for Q&A. But what I like about this is because really what we're talking about is practicing resilience. But we hear that word all the time, or I don't know about you. I hear the word resilience and I hear the word mindfulness all the time. And most of the time, if someone were to be asked, how would you, like, definition of resilience or definition of mindfulness, all of a sudden it's like, I don't really know. It's like, I get what it is, but how would I define that? So if we're thinking about resilience, I like to break it down into different categories, which sort of brings it full circle to earlier when I was talking about how would you notice that you are reintegrating more effectively, and seeing it through these different perspectives. You know, maybe I need to really work on being connected to others. It's been super difficult being socially isolated. That sense of being part of a team, that sense of human connection, you know, is big for me. So what are some things I can strategize around? Kind of like some of the suggestions we talked about earlier. Maybe I find myself getting really caught up in worst case scenario thinking, you know, and as I go into this stressful adjustment period, my brain's going to be like, now's the time, you know, to go into worst case scenarios. So maybe I need to practice some CBT skills. You know, there's different things that we may notice. And again, all of us have areas of improvement in all of these, and nobody is perfect. So we are all just doing what we can. I want to clarify, especially on optimism. Optimism here does not mean I'm happy all the time, I think everything's perfect. That is not what that is. Optimism is similar to mental agility, where it's kind of over in that same category of, if I think to myself, I know that I have the skills to get through this. You know, I can perceive different outcomes that aren't necessarily just worst case scenario. And so I wanted to clarify that, because sometimes when we hear optimism, we think of this, you know, again, I think everything's perfect all the time, I'm always in a good mood. That is not what that means. It's really sort of that ability to see a bigger picture, see multiple possible outcomes, and to have a sense of empowerment and sense of self that we can get through it. And also, and this is where the self-awareness piece comes in, self-regulation, strength of character, that if we need help, it's okay. All of us do sometimes. So seeking help, seeking support when we need it. So if kind of this overview of what resilience looks like can help you to kind of think about, what is one of these 6 things that I could focus on in the next week? The job, you know, the task isn't that I need to figure out how to do it perfectly, but just how would I even assess where I'm at on that? And what are some things I could do differently? We talked about this a little bit already. And the main thing that I really wanted to remind everyone is that everybody's boundaries are valid. So really figure out, you know, what are some of the boundaries that you need during times of transition, and it might be different than other people. So it's okay to have that conversation. Name it to tame it is a, you know, quick, brief sentence describing how to cope with emotions. Because when we're feeling overwhelmed or we're feeling emotions that we don't like to feel, we tend to, and I don't think this is, you know, news to anyone, avoid them or deny them. But what that does is that gives them more power over us, because if we're avoiding something, it's an indicator of fear. And everybody does this all the time. So I say that with zero judgment because that is the human condition. But what we'll sometimes do is like, I'll just pretend that feeling's not there, or I'll overly distract myself, or whatever the case may be that all of us do sometimes. But if we were just to name what we're feeling, it actually takes a lot of power away because we're looking at it. We're not trying to avoid it. And practicing that, I think, more often can really help. Sometimes by doing that and sort of taking more ownership over what you're feeling and naming it at the time will reduce it showing up when you least want it to, which usually is when you're trying to fall asleep. It's like, surprise, I'm here now. You tried to avoid me all day. And so when we can actually take a look at it and name it at a time that works for us, it can give us more empowerment over our day. So that is something that we have to practice. Most of us have not been taught how to emotion manage, how to communicate effectively. So all of us struggle with this, and it takes practice and different strategies. Everyone needs different things. So this is really just kind of an overview that hopefully gave you some kind of concrete things to try. And I want to spend some time answering some questions now. Let me see here. All right. So I have a few questions and comments. I know some of you commented a little bit earlier and I haven't been ignoring you, but I'm just looking to see what we've got here. Okay. So one person's talking about how, and I kind of touched on this earlier, if, say, for example, you're working from home, and many people, they may live alone, and I don't know if you do or not, but just kind of extrapolating on part of what you had said, a lot of people say, I haven't had a lot of social interaction, maybe you've been like chit-chatting with a pet, or whatever the case may be. And that, I think, is common. I've heard a lot of people say that. It's like, how do I interact with society again? And number one, I know this isn't an answer or a solution, but number one, I think most people are feeling that way. And I appreciate you sharing that, because for a lot of us, even just admitting that is anxiety inducing, of like, are my social skills still in existence? And that's where some of it is slowing down, and I think one of the ways that can show up as being overwhelming is if someone's like, oh gosh, now I've filled my calendar with all these activities and I don't even know where my social skills are at. So taking things one at a time. And also, if you're kind of jumping back into social interactions, maybe start with ones that aren't going to be super long, like a shorter interaction. I have, perfect example. I saw a friend recently, and he was talking, he's like, I have about an hour right now of like social energy with people, and then I need to sort of allow myself some time again. And and I think a lot of us are trying to figure out, like, how do I slowly reintegrate? It doesn't have to be this like pendulum from 0 to 60 right away. So figuring out, like, and that's back to those social boundaries, emotional boundaries, like how much energy do I have, and how do I utilize that energy so I don't overwhelm myself? Yeah, so, one person made a comment, and this is true too, that we talk a lot about these self-care activities, but don't actually do them. And I completely agree with you. That happens a lot. Some of it's we just get super busy. But one thing I hear a lot is, I don't have time to do them. And I hear you. Number one, that's why I try to share some that only take less than 5 seconds, because, I realize we don't all have 30 minutes to do some long guided imagery meditation. So what are small, quick things that we can do? And then also, usually when we're building a new habit, we have to either set an alarm or do something that reminds us to do it, because myself included, if I just try to remind myself to do that 3-step relaxation, I'll get to mid-afternoon and be like, yeah, I've totally forgot to do that again. So that's where set a reminder on your phone or add it into your calendar or schedule a few times. It's also, I think, really important to take breaks. Sometimes when we're adjusting and we're trying to, do everything, we skip breaks, we take short lunches, and that's going to burn us out real quick. And one person's talking about how they carry a lot of their anxiety in their shoulders, very common. So that 3-step relaxation can be very powerful. And so just really thinking about, what are things that I need? What are the things that are causing me some anxiety? Number one, I bet most other people feel the same way. What do I need? How do I practice this? Yeah, and there's someone also talking about feeling overwhelmed again, kind of moving back into a place that's super social, super, loud, kind of busy environment. And for some people, having some space away from that for a while, they may have realized that is, again, that sensory overload. And so really paying attention to, what's in my control and what's not. It could be where it's like, yeah, part of reintegration is that there's going to be a big shift back to a difference in sensory overload. So number one, what are some ways that I might be able to advocate for myself? The other thing I think is important, and I talked about lunches and breaks too, and I think a lot of people do this, but sometimes they don't, is that we don't actually like step away literally for our lunches and breaks. And that's been actually sometimes an opposite effect when a lot of people move to working from home, is they're like, I don't really take breaks anymore because everything's in the same place. But that's another boundary to set. So if a person's feeling like I'm back in this space, it's loud, it's busy, and I just feel like overwhelmed by it, this kind of like oppressive amount of external stimuli, is think, how can I find a place to take breaks and take lunch that aren't that? And that might be something to strategize around. So there's this, and we talk about this with organizations too. More organizations are having quiet rooms that people can go into, because we are not meant to just be like bombarded with stimulation all the time like that. So that can be one way to kind of figure out a plan for that. Also moving around. So, whether your break, if you went somewhere that was quiet, there's also, if you have like headphones, you can listen to calming music and move around a little bit. Really that like physical boundary of like stepping away from that space allows that sense of truly, quite literally, a break. And with stress eating too, someone asked about that. And this will probably be the last thing I can answer because we have 3 more minutes. And I love everyone's questions. With stress eating, this is a big one because as with any major life adjustment, our diet changes. I think for some people, kind of like I mentioned earlier, what if I'm now commuting a lot longer? It's harder to factor in healthy cooking. And this is where it's like even just super simple things. So it's okay if you haven't like perfectly meal prepped every single item all week. We're doing the best we can. We're adjusting. We're figuring out what works or what doesn't. For dinners, trying to figure out, okay, I'm going to try to eat healthy, but what's something I can make that will last 2 or 3 meals instead of feeling like, oh gosh, I'm going in this week and I've got to cook something every single night. And trying to kind of, nothing too stressful, but something that still feels like I'm getting some healthy food in there. So there may be some, this goes back to some of those logistics. How have I planned around changing shopping for food and then making this not too much of a shock to our system of now I've got to try to cook exactly like I was before when I had more time. Those may be some changes. That's another thing that you can utilize the EAP for is life coaching. And that would be a perfect example. So life coaching is over the phone. It's 3 free sessions. If it's just trying to figure out some strategies, some solution-focused ideas for life adjustment, that's exactly what that can help with. And so if it helps to kind of bounce ideas off someone and get more detailed about your specific scenario, because I know it's hard to answer some of these questions super broadly, we can help you with that. So that's another thing to think about as a takeaway, like beyond today's presentation, what are ways that EAP can help me during this time? And all of our information here is on this last slide. So you can call us, you can text us, you can email, you can go on our website and live chat with us. Probably just about anything that you're thinking is possibly stressful during reintegration, whether it's logistics around life, or whether it's stress or emotional stress, we can help you with. You are not alone. That is what we're here for. So please contact us if you need further services beyond today's webinar. And I wish we had more time to talk about this, and of course, within an hour, and I know everyone has some, I'm sure something they need to get to in the next minute. So I appreciate so much everyone's participation, and I hope that this was a helpful kind of way to start thinking about how to take care of yourself. If you need anything further, again, please contact your EAP and take care and have a wonderful rest of your week.